At 11:30 on a cold October night in Millbrook, Jake Martinez carefully taped his 7-year-old daughter's latest crayon drawing to the refrigerator. 3 stick figures under a crooked roof. Daddy, me, and Mommy in heaven. 18 months since Sarah's funeral, and Emma still drew her into every family portrait. Jake pressed his forehead against the cool metal door, listening to the apartment's silence. Rain hammered the windows. Lightning split the darkness. When he stepped outside to grab forgotten mail from the lobby, he found her. A woman in a $2,000 suit crumpled on the front steps. Designer heels scattered. Hermes bag soaked through. She clutched a shattered iPhone, frantically tapping the black screen. Her keycard dangled useless from manicured fingers. Locked out. Desperate. Jake stared at this broken billionaire who had no idea that the scruffy mechanic watching her meltdown was about to become the one person who could either save her or destroy everything she'd spent her life building. Jake hesitated at the glass doors, watching the woman's shoulders shake. Her silk blouse clung to her frame, ruined by rain. She looked up when his work boots scraped concrete. Her eyes were red-rimmed, mascara smeared down her cheeks. Neither spoke. The storm filled the silence between them, and Jake found himself studying her face. Sharp cheekbones that belonged on magazine covers, not apartment steps at midnight. "Need help?" His voice came out rougher than intended. 18 months of minimal conversation had left him rusty with strangers. She blinked at him, taking in his oil-stained uniform shirt. Jake Martinez looked like exactly what he was, a single father who fixed engines for a living and hadn't slept properly since his wife died. Nothing about him suggested he had any business helping someone who clearly moved in circles where his annual salary was pocket change. "My keycard won't work." Her voice carried traces of expensive education. Panic lived underneath the careful pronunciation. "The battery on my phone died, and She gestured helplessly at the electronic lock. "I live in 4B. I just need to get inside." There was something rehearsed about the way she said it, as if she'd practiced the explanation, but wasn't quite sure she believed it herself. Jake pulled out his worn keycard. "4B's been empty for months," he said, watching her face carefully. Something flickered in her expression. Not surprise, but the look of someone whose lie had just been called out. "But the lock system's been acting up all week. Let me try mine." He swiped his card, and the door clicked open. The woman exhaled sharply, relief and embarrassment washing over her features. "Thank you." She gathered her scattered belongings with sharp, efficient movements. "I'm Katherine Morrison." The name hung in the air between them, and Jake caught the slight hesitation before she said it, like she was trying on someone else's identity for size. He held the door open, noting how she avoided his eyes as she slipped past him into the warm lobby. Her perfume, something expensive that probably cost more than his monthly rent, mixed with the scent of rain and desperation. The lobby's fluorescent lights revealed more than darkness had hidden. Katherine Morrison looked like money, the kind that didn't just buy things, but bought invisibility, power, the ability to make problems disappear with a phone call. Yet here she was, stranded and vulnerable, depending on a stranger's kindness. Jake watched her straighten her shoulders, assembling her composure like armor. But her hands shook as she pressed the elevator button, and he caught the way she studied the directory board as if seeing it for the first time. As the elevator arrived and Katherine stepped inside, she turned back to him. "I owe you one," she said, and the simple phrase carried disproportionate weight. The doors closed between them, but Jake remained in the lobby, staring at the numbers as they climbed. 4. The elevator stopped at 4, and somehow that felt significant. He'd lived in this building for 3 years, had walked past apartment 4B countless times. The door had never opened. No sounds ever came from within. Yet Katherine Morrison had a keycard and spoke like she belonged there. Jake climbed the stairs to his own apartment, each step heavy with questions he couldn't shake. In 2A, Emma slept peacefully, surrounded by artwork that served as her way of processing a world that had taken her mother too soon. He checked on her, adjusting the blanket she'd kicked off, then returned to the kitchen where her latest drawing still hung on the refrigerator. 3 stick figures. Daddy, me, and Mommy in heaven. But as he stared at the simple crayon lines, Jake found himself wondering about the woman in 4B and why someone who could afford designer everything would be locked out of an apartment that had been empty since he'd moved in. The next morning arrived grey and tired. Jake made breakfast for Emma while she chatted about Saturday plans. 7-year-old conversations jumped from topic to topic with pinball randomness, and Jake found himself only half listening until she mentioned seeing the pretty lady with the sad eyes in the laundry room. He paused, spatula halfway to the pan. Emma had a way of noticing things adults missed, emotional frequencies that bypassed logic and went straight to intuition. "Did you talk to her?" Jake asked, keeping his voice casual as he flipped Emma's pancake. The morning routine had become sacred, one of the few constants in a life rebuilt from scratch after Sarah's death. Pancakes on Saturday mornings, made from the recipe Sarah had insisted on teaching him during her final weeks. The batter was always too thick, the heat never quite right, but Emma never complained. She was washing fancy clothes by hand? Emma said, making a face that suggested she found this puzzling. And she didn't have quarters for the machines. She looked at me for a long time, like she was trying to remember something. Emma's observations carried unfiltered honesty that made Jake both proud and protective. His daughter saw the world without adult filters, which made her insights valuable and her vulnerability terrifying. That afternoon at the park, Jake spotted Katherine on a bench near the duck pond. She sat alone, no longer in the expensive suit, but wearing jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Jake's monthly car payment. She watched the water with complete absorption, as if answers to important questions might surface among the ripples. Their eyes met across the playground, and Katherine offered a small wave that Emma immediately returned with enthusiasm. Emma abandoned the swings and marched over to the bench with the confidence of someone who'd never learned that strangers could be dangerous. Jake followed, partly from parental duty and partly from curiosity he couldn't name. "You're the lady from the laundry room," Emma announced, settling beside Katherine with casual intimacy. "Daddy helped you get into the building last night." Katherine's smile was genuine for the first time since Jake had met her, transforming her face from beautiful to radiant. "He did," she agreed, her attention focused entirely on Emma, with careful attention of someone accustomed to remembering names because forgetting them had consequences. Emma launched into her standard introduction, which included her age, favorite color, and opinion on whether dinosaurs would have liked ice cream. Katherine listened with the patience of someone who understood that 7-year-old logic followed its own rules. The conversation drifted to Emma's artwork, which Katherine seemed genuinely interested in discussing. When Emma mentioned her latest project, a family portrait for the school art show, Katherine's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you ever draw people you haven't met?" she asked, something in her tone making Jake pay closer attention. Emma considered this seriously. "Sometimes I draw Mommy's friend Sophie," she said finally. "Mommy told me about her before she went to heaven. Sophie went there first, when she was little like me." Katherine went very still, and Jake saw her hands clench in her lap. For a moment he thought she might cry, but instead she reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. "Would you like to see something?" she asked Emma, flipping through pages covered in architectural sketches until she found what she was looking for. It was a child's drawing, clearly not done by Katherine, but carefully preserved. A little girl with curly hair and a big smile, standing next to a stick-figure woman under a rainbow. "A friend of mine drew this," Katherine said quietly. "Her name was Sophia." The past tense wasn't lost on Jake, and he saw Emma's face grow solemn with the recognition children had for loss. "Did Sophia go to heaven too?" she asked, and Katherine nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The silence stretched between them, filled with understanding that transcended age and circumstances. Emma reached over and patted Katherine's hand with the automatic comfort children offered to hurting adults. "Sophia and Mommy are probably friends now," Emma said with the certainty of someone whose world still allowed for such possibilities. "They can watch over us together." Katherine's composure finally cracked, tears spilling over despite her obvious efforts to maintain control. Jake felt something shift in his chest, the first stirring of attraction he'd experienced since Sarah's death, mixed with protective instincts he'd thought were reserved for his daughter. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed with increasing frequency. Katherine appeared at Rosie's diner when her credit card was declined, embarrassment acute until Jake quietly paid her tab. They talked for nearly an hour, conversation flowing with surprising ease once Katherine stopped trying so hard to control it. She asked about Emma, about his work, about life in Millbrook, with genuine interest that made ordinary things seem fascinating. At the playground, Katherine fixed Emma's broken swing with tools from her expensive sedan, talking to Emma about art with maternal instinct that surprised Jake. She understood 7-year-old logic in a way that suggested experience with children. When Emma showed her a drawing, Katherine's reaction was intense, emotional, like she was seeing something precious and painful simultaneously. Their friendship developed with natural rhythm. Katherine helped Emma with homework at the diner, Jake watching them together and feeling something he'd thought was dead forever. Katherine caught him staring, and for a moment her careful composure dropped. She looked vulnerable, almost afraid of caring. Jake noticed she never mentioned family, friends, or permanent address, deflecting personal questions with humor and redirection. One evening, Katherine joined them for dinner. Emma gave her a comprehensive tour of their small apartment, explaining each drawing, the significance of various books, the proper way to greet their cat Whiskers. Katherine listened with patience that suggested she found children's worlds genuinely fascinating. She'd brought art supplies, not basic crayons, but professional-grade colored pencils that made Emma gasp with delight. Dinner conversation flowed easily, Katherine asking questions that drew Emma into animated explanations. When Emma mentioned missing her mother during school events, Katherine's response was perfect, acknowledging the sadness without trying to fix it. "My friend Sophia used to tell me that missing someone meant you were lucky to have had them to miss," Katherine said quietly. She was very wise for someone so young. After Emma's bedtime routine, Katherine helped with cleanup in a way that felt natural rather than obligatory. They worked together in the small kitchen, conversation flowing around mundane tasks with comfortable familiarity. She fit into their space as if she'd been there before, understanding without being told where things belonged and how their routines worked. "Thank you for tonight," Katherine said as they finished the dishes. "I haven't felt this normal in a very long time." The word choice was interesting. Not happy or comfortable, but normal. As if ordinary domestic life was something she'd lost access to. Jake found himself wondering what Katherine's regular life looked like. What kind of obligations had made a simple dinner feel like an extraordinary luxury? 3 weeks after their first meeting, crisis struck. Emma's fever spiked to 103 degrees at school, high enough to trigger emergency protocols. Jake's truck chose that moment to die completely, leaving him stranded when Emma needed him most. Desperation made him call Katherine's number before he could second-guess the decision. She answered immediately, her voice carrying crisp efficiency. "Jake, what's wrong?" The concern in her tone suggested she'd recognized something urgent in his voice. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said after he explained, and Jake heard car doors slamming, an engine starting, someone who'd dropped everything to respond to crisis. She arrived in 7 minutes, driving a black sedan with a driver who waited silently, while Katherine gestured for Jake to get behind the wheel. "You know the way better than I do," she said simply, intuiting that he needed to be doing something active rather than sitting helplessly. At the hospital, Katherine's presence transformed their experience in ways Jake didn't immediately understand. Nurses moved with immediate efficiency, a pediatric doctor appeared within minutes, and Emma's treatment proceeded with smooth coordination. It wasn't until Jake overheard a nurse addressing Katherine as Ms. Morrison, with obvious recognition, that he began to understand why their hospital experience was proceeding so unusually well. Katherine's insurance card was platinum-level corporate coverage that suggested connections and resources far beyond what Jake had imagined. When Katherine stepped into the hallway to take a phone call, Jake caught fragments that made his growing suspicions crystallize. "The board meeting can wait," followed by, "Yes, I understand the Tokyo acquisition is time-sensitive, but I'm dealing with a family emergency." His phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor, a news link that made his blood turn cold. The headline read, "Morrison Development Corp. CEO missing for weeks as major acquisition stalls." The article described Katherine Morrison as a reclusive billionaire who'd built a real estate empire on strategic acquisitions of residential properties for luxury development. Morrison Corp was currently pursuing several major acquisitions in upstate New York communities, including Millbrook. When Katherine returned from her call, Jake was staring at his phone screen. She glanced at the article he was reading, and he watched her face change as she realized her cover had been blown. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of deception settling between them like a physical presence. Emma slept peacefully on the hospital bed, unaware that the adult world was collapsing around her once again. "How long?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Katherine's composure cracked, tears spilling despite her efforts to maintain control. 3 weeks, she said finally. "I came to Millbrook to evaluate the Cedar Grove acquisition personally. I've been staying in 4B to understand the community before we proceed with development." "So this was all research?" Jake's voice carried hurt and anger in equal measure. "Emma was research? Getting close to us, learning about our lives, figuring out the best way to destroy our home. Was that part of your evaluation process?" Katherine reached toward him, then dropped her hand when she saw him recoil. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said desperately. "Meeting you and Emma changed everything." Jake stood abruptly, unable to sit still while processing the magnitude of Katherine's deception. "You're worth billions of dollars," he said, his voice rising despite Emma's proximity. "I was worried about grocery money, about keeping Emma in decent clothes. And you were playing house with us while planning to make us homeless." The class divide between them had never felt more like an unbridgeable chasm. "Emma asked me last week if you were going to be her new mommy," he continued, his voice breaking despite his anger. "Do you have any idea what that did to me? She's already lost one mother, and I let her get attached to someone who was always planning to leave." Katherine's tears came harder now, but Jake found himself unmoved by her distress. From the hallway, Katherine's phone rang insistently, probably her business associates demanding attention for the corporate empire she'd temporarily abandoned. The sound served as auditory reminder of the vast distance between their worlds, the impossibility of bridging gaps created by wealth and power and responsibilities Jake couldn't comprehend. Katherine gathered her belongings with shaking hands, her composed facade completely shattered. "Jake, please," she said. but he couldn't look at her without seeing dollar signs and development plans, and the casual cruelty of someone who could afford to treat other people's lives as abstract business problems. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to care about you both so much. As Katherine left the hospital room, Jake sat beside Emma's bed and tried to process the emotional whiplash. His daughter was safe, her fever broken and smile returning. But the woman who'd helped them through the crisis, who'd become integral to their daily happiness, was gone, leaving behind questions and betrayals that Jake didn't know how to resolve. 3 weeks passed with slow weight of adjustments Jake had hoped never to make again. Emma asked about Katherine daily for the first week, then every few days. Then, with resigned acceptance, children developed when they realized adults couldn't fix everything that broke. Jake offered explanations that were true, but incomplete. Katherine had to go back to her regular job. She lived far away. Sometimes friendships ended even when people cared about each other. Work became Jake's refuge again. The familiar rhythm of mechanical problems providing structure when everything else felt uncertain. His sleep patterns deteriorated back into the insomnia that had plagued him since Sarah's death. He found himself lying awake, thinking about conversations with Katherine, analyzing them for signs of deception he'd missed, trying to separate genuine parts from performance. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Jake's body finally rebelled against weeks of poor sleep and accumulated stress. He was diagnosing a transmission problem when the world suddenly tilted sideways, his vision tunneling before going black entirely. His co-worker found him on the garage floor, called an ambulance, and made the phone call that Jake had hoped would never be necessary. Emma's terror when she saw her father unconscious in a hospital bed was the kind of fear that Jake had worked 18 months to help her overcome. She'd watched one parent die in a medical facility, had learned to associate hospitals with permanent loss. Now she was facing the possibility of losing her remaining parent, and Jake could see the panic in her eyes, even as he struggled to reassure her that exhaustion wasn't the same as terminal illness. Emma kept asking for Katherine, repeating her name with the insistence of someone who believed the right person could fix anything if they just showed up and cared enough to try. Jake's heart broke as he realized that in Emma's mind, Katherine had become associated with safety and competence in emergencies, with maternal strength that could solve problems and make everything better. He was trying to find words to help Emma understand why Katherine couldn't come when she appeared in the hospital room doorway, like an answer to prayers Jake hadn't realized he'd been saying. She looked different, smaller somehow, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of expensive clothes, her hair pulled back simply, her face free of makeup and marked by obvious exhaustion. But Emma's face lit up with relief and joy that made Jake's chest tighten with emotions he'd been trying to suppress. "How did you know?" Jake asked as Katherine settled into the chair beside his bed, Emma immediately claiming space on her lap with possessive affection. Katherine's smile was soft and sad, carrying weight that suggested the last 3 weeks had been as difficult for her as they'd been for Jake and Emma. "Mrs. Henderson called me," Katherine said simply. "Emma had my number memorized, and she kept asking for me." Jake found himself studying her face, looking for signs of the calculating corporate executive he'd discovered 3 weeks earlier, but seeing only exhaustion and genuine concern for Emma's well-being. "I need to tell you something," Katherine said after Emma had settled into comfortable silence from being held by someone who felt safe. "About Morrison Corp, about what I've been doing, about why I really came to Millbrook." Jake tensed, preparing for more revelations, but Katherine's next words weren't what he expected. "I resigned as CEO 2 weeks ago. The board voted me out after I refused to proceed with the Cedar Grove acquisition." The information hit Jake like a physical blow, reframing everything he thought he understood about Katherine's motivations. You gave up your company? He asked, unable to process the magnitude of what she was saying. Katherine nodded, her arms tightening around Emma. I couldn't do it, she said simply. I couldn't destroy your home, couldn't displace families for profit margins. The board was right to remove me. I'd stopped being the kind of CEO they needed. Jake stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman who'd walked away from billions with the calculating executive he'd imagined during their separation. Why? He asked, though part of him was afraid to hear the answer. Katherine's smile was heartbreaking, full of loss and love and choices that couldn't be undone. Because Emma drew pictures of stick figures living in that building, she said quietly. Because you make pancakes on Sunday mornings using your wife's recipe. Because home isn't something you can rebuild somewhere else. The conversation that followed was halting and careful, both of them navigating around hurt and betrayal while trying to find their way back to the connection that had developed before Katherine's true identity was revealed. She told him about her daughter Sophia, about the car accident that had killed her, and the way Katherine had buried her grief in corporate success until meeting Emma had forced her to remember what she'd lost. Sophia would have been 8 this year, Katherine said, her voice breaking. She died on March 15th, the day after her 7th birthday. I was driving her to school when a truck ran a red light. Jake felt his own eyes fill with tears as he understood the full weight of what Katherine had carried alone, the way Emma's age and enthusiasm must have been both wonderful and unbearable reminders of the child she'd lost. Emma listened to Katherine's story with solemn attention, reaching up to touch Katherine's face when tears started to fall. Sophia and Mommy are probably friends in heaven, she said with matter-of-fact certainty. They can take care of each other until we get there. Katherine's sob was half laugh, half heartbreak, and Jake realized his daughter had just offered the kind of comfort that adults struggled to provide. The days that followed passed in careful dance of reconnection and healing. Katherine present, but not presumptuous. Helpful, but not intrusive. Clearly determined to earn back the trust she'd lost through deception. She brought Emma to visit Jake every day, staying in the background while Emma chatted about school and art projects she was working on to surprise her father when he came home. When Jake was finally discharged, Katherine was there to drive them home, and Jake found himself noticing details about her presence that felt different from their earlier friendship. She moved through their apartment with familiarity, but not presumption, helping Emma with homework and dinner preparations in ways that felt like partnership rather than performance. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by jeans and sweaters that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. What happens now? Jake asked one evening after Emma was asleep, the question encompassing everything from Katherine's living situation to their relationship to the complicated process of rebuilding trust after betrayal. Katherine was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. I don't know, she said finally. I've never not known what happens next. I've spent my entire adult life planning and strategizing and controlling outcomes. But this, us, I don't know how to plan for this. The conversation stretched late into the night, both of them working through complicated emotions that came with second chances and new beginnings. Katherine talked about her plans to stay in Millbrook, about the house she was buying near the elementary school, about her intention to start a non-profit focused on affordable housing development. Jake shared his fears about trusting someone with Emma's heart again, about his own growing feelings for Katherine, and the terror that came with loving someone who could leave or be taken away. 6 months later, Jake woke on a Sunday morning to the sound of Emma's laughter coming from the kitchen, followed by Katherine's voice explaining proper pancake flipping technique. The sounds had become familiar over the winter months, as Katherine gradually became part of their weekend routines and daily rhythms. She had her own key now, her own coffee mug in the cupboard, her own space in Emma's artwork, and Jake's carefully guarded heart. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been difficult conversations about boundaries and expectations, moments when Emma tested Katherine's commitment, times when Jake's fears about loss had made him withdraw into protective distance. But Katherine had met each challenge with patience and consistency, proving through daily actions that she was committed to building something lasting rather than playing at domestic life. Jake found Katherine in the kitchen wearing one of his old t-shirts over jeans, completely absorbed in teaching Emma advanced pancake technique. The scene was so perfectly domestic that it took his breath away, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had become so familiar he couldn't imagine their lives without it. Katherine looked up when she heard his footsteps, offering the smile that had become his favorite way to start each day. After breakfast, they walked to the park where Jake and Katherine had first talked, while Emma played on equipment Katherine had helped repair months earlier. The routine had become precious to all of them, a weekly ritual that marked time and progress, and the gradual transformation of grief into something that could coexist with happiness. "I have something to tell you," Katherine said, her voice carrying excitement rather than anxiety. She pulled a folded paper from her jacket pocket, smoothing it carefully before handing it to Jake. It was a letter from the Millbrook Planning Commission, officially approving Katherine's proposal to convert the old Morrison Corp development plans into a community land trust that would preserve affordable housing while improving living conditions for existing residents. Jake read the letter twice, hardly believing that the threat to Cedar Grove apartments had been transformed into protection that would last for generations. "You did this?" he asked, though he knew the answer from Katherine's proud smile. She'd spent months working with lawyers and city planners, using her business expertise and remaining resources to create something that would benefit the community rather than displacing it. "We did this," Katherine corrected gently. "You and Emma showed me what home actually means, what's worth protecting and preserving. I just had the resources to make it happen." The distinction mattered to Jake because it acknowledged the collaborative nature of what they'd built together. Not Katherine rescuing them with her wealth, but all three of them working to create something better than what any of them could have achieved alone. That evening, after Emma was asleep and Katherine was preparing to go to her own house, Jake found himself reluctant to let the day end. "Stay," he said quietly, the word carrying months of accumulated longing and trust and hope for what they might build together. Katherine's smile was radiant as she settled beside him on the couch, both of them understanding that they were crossing a threshold into something new and precious and worth protecting. They talked late into the night about plans and dreams and the careful work of building love that could last, their voices quiet so as not to wake Emma, but their words carrying the weight of promises and possibilities that felt as solid as the ground beneath their feet. When Katherine finally fell asleep with her head on Jake's shoulder, he stayed awake watching her breathe, thinking about second chance and the unexpected ways that loss could transform into love. That betrayal could become the foundation for deeper trust, that broken families could heal and grow and become something even more beautiful than what they'd lost.